I hear that you've had these Growing Up in Science talks a couple of times before, and that it was modeled after what we're doing at NYU. So maybe it's good if I tell you a little bit about what we do at NYU before I start telling you my own story. Okay? Who has been to the previous events? Anyone has been to previous events? Awesome. Okay. So yeah, at NYU, we started this in 2014. We being Cristina Alberini and myself. Cristina Alberini was a colleague of mine in the neuroscience department who was also a part-time psychoanalyst, and she would maintain a practice and she would see a patient every week. And then one day we were just having lunch and we came to talk on the topic of mental health in grad students. And as a psychoanalyst, she felt that this was a completely underappreciated topic, something that needed to be much more highlighted, given much more attention. And I personally also had a lot of experience of students coming to me to talk about struggles that they had in their labs and with their advisors. And I don't know why, maybe I was quite approachable. So, but out of those two ideas came the idea of doing Growing Up in Science, where faculty would just talk about their struggles and the failures and the detours and the doubts and insecurities and everything that could go wrong and did go wrong in their careers. And we've done that since 2014. Since we started, we also introduced gradually non-faculty speakers. Some people went into industry, other jobs, some postdocs, some graduate students. We have some special events on diversity, inclusion, identity. But the bulk of what we do is still people's individual stories. And in science, we all used to sort of reducing things to simplicity, like breaking down complex phenomena to simple components and then analyzing the depth out of those components. So the philosophy of Growing Up in Science is very, very different. So this is not the kind of situation where I sit here to give you advice. I'm not, my story is just one story. You've heard other stories. Every story has its own quirks and idiosyncrasies. Every story is unique. If you were to be able to tell your story, it would also be very different. So the purpose of the series is not to sort of give generic advice or these are the things you should do to be successful. I have no idea about that, right? But it's more the tradition of cultural anthropology or narrative medicine, where you respect people's personal narratives, their first-person perspectives, like the things that you experienced as you went through your career, the things that you felt, the things that you're feeling now, how you relate to other people. This is very anecdotal. This is not scientific. This is about you as a person and how you interact with the world around you. I think that we have too little of that in science. Right? If you think about all the seminars that you go to in a year, it's probably maybe 50 talks or 100 talks, and like the vast majority of them are about research. And some of them might be about career development, and that's great. But there's very little about the story behind the scientist and what do you do if you struggle with certain feelings. And those are the things that actually can be much more important for your happiness than knowing the latest and greatest papers. Okay, so the philosophy of this series is to open up a discussion about the things that make us human, and particularly that make us human as scientists. And this conversation, I hope, would also then extend beyond the event, so that people would be part of a more open dialogue, a more open community, where you can talk with each other and maybe with your advisors about these kinds of things. So that was a very long introduction, but I think it's important to say that what I'm going to tell you, you shouldn't take as advice. And there are probably many things in my story that you should not do. But should or should not is not the point. It's just one story, and I hope at some point to hear your story as well. My story starts in a small village in the Netherlands. So I am third generation Dutch, as is obvious from my looks and my name. My grandparents came from China. Anybody from China here? Great. So it's a province called Shandong. It's just south of Beijing, but in the north of the country. My grandparents were farmers, and or they came from a farming family, but they immigrated to Holland and they started trading Chinese arts and crafts to Holland. My mom was already born in Holland, so my mom's first language is Dutch. And culturally, she's also an interesting mix because she is still very much a good Chinese daughter in the sense that studying is important, social life is not important. But she's also sort of rebellious in the tradition of Holland in the 1960s. It was a very rebellious time, right? Like experimenting with drugs and personal freedoms and emancipation. So it was a lot of things that were happening. My mom was also part of that generation. So when I grew up, I got sort of a little bit of both, right? I was a lot of emphasis on my grades, but at the same time, I was also raised to sort of be a little bit of a rebel and to question authority and to fight authority and to notice injustice. Injustice done to ourselves, but also injustice done to other people. So my mom was extremely political for somebody who came from a very traditional Chinese family. I was born in this small village, but when I was 5, we moved to the bigger city. Bigger city means 200,000 people, so it's still a pretty small city. It was also a very homogeneous city. So this was in the north of Holland, a place called Groningen. Who has heard of Groningen? Okay, who has heard of Groningen from the little bio that I wrote? Yeah, okay. But yeah, so it's a very small town, very homogeneous, especially in those days. It was like just Dutch people, like Dutch people. So just to illustrate that, my high school, it had 400 people or so, 400 students, and maybe 5 of them were Chinese and 2 of them were my brothers. So it was not exactly like the most diverse community. So like that already made me very aware of my identity. Like as a Chinese person, you were only, or even as any Asian person, you were just the only Asian in the group, right? So they would not refer to you as Wei Ji or Ming-san, but they would refer to you as the Chinese guy, right? Yeah, that's just how it worked in these very homogeneous communities. And the other thing that made me really weird is that I easily got bored. So the consequence of that was that if I got bored playing with my classmates, I became very unpleasant to both my classmates and the teacher. So they tried to find more challenging material for me, and I ended up skipping grades. Now, skipping grades is not necessarily a good idea because it takes you out of your peer group and the kids who are the same age as you. But in my case, it might have been the only way for me to just keep being challenged. Like Dutch culture, anybody from Holland here? That would be probably unlikely, but yeah, the Dutch culture is very egalitarian, right? So it is egalitarian and not meritocratic. So it means that pretty much people have to be the same. If you're lower than average, you're being pulled up. If you're above that average, you get cut off, right? So that's sort of the mentality. So it was really quite a struggle for my mom mostly to put me in an environment where I would get enough intellectual challenge. And the only way that could be accomplished was for me to skip grades. I skipped grades in primary school. I skipped 4 grades. So that means that like normally you enter middle school in Holland when you're 12, and I entered when I was 8. So needless to say that that makes for a fucked up childhood. I'll just say it honestly. Can I curse on video? But yeah, you are then 4 years younger than your peers during adolescence, right? And that's just a weird situation. Socially, you're way behind. Like your classmates start dating, and you say, "What are they doing? Ew." Like intellectually, it was fine, but it just made me weird from a very young age on. Like I have a baby son now, and he's still 1 year old, so this is a little bit away. But I sometimes think, would I let him skip grades? And I'm really not so sure, right? If it's possible to not skip grades, it's probably better. Anyway, so this weirdness also had the consequence that from when I was very young, people already treated me as a genius. And if you think about it, that's really weird, because they wouldn't even know how I was doing in school. They would just see that I was 4 years younger, right? So, oh, you're 4 years younger than everybody else, you must be a genius, right? And they didn't realize that skipping the grades was just in primary school, where most people just play, right? So then that created in me this sense that even if I didn't do anything, I would already be admired, right? And to be honest, I really enjoyed that. I really liked being admired. I still like that. So that's a narcissist in me. But I also it caused me to be very lazy, and it had long-term consequences, which I will talk about in a second. Then I went to middle school, which in Dutch is actually middle school and high school is one school. So you go from 12 to 18 to middle school plus high school. And any guesses what my favorite subject was in school? Any guesses? Math, yeah, that's a very good guess. It's not the right one. No, it was, yeah, so gym didn't work, because I would be, can you actually physically jump over this? No, it was Latin. Like I learned, like I was in a school, in this old-fashioned grammar school. It's called Gymnasium in Germany and in Holland, where you learn Latin and Greek. Like not to speak, but just to translate ancient texts. And I really love that. I love translating Cicero's or Tacitus from Latin to Dutch. Like Latin is actually a very logical language. Greek is a very messy language. There's all kinds of little words that are strewn in that mean nothing. Anybody has learned Latin? Greek? Okay, all right. Maybe you can relate. Anyway, so I thought, well, actually, maybe I should pursue what I'm good at, but then there's not exactly a blooming market for classicists. So maybe you should talk about that with your husband's experience. But I ended up studying physics. So that was also not complete coincidence, because when I was in the 5th grade of high school, that was the second to last grade, I went on a physics Olympiad for school teams. This is not to be confused with the individual Olympiad, where you actually have to be good at physics. This was a team competition where schools would compete, and it was sort of an experimental, and not a lot of schools participated, so we actually won that in spite of me being the lowest of the school team. And then there were 3 teams that competed in national competition, and then we won that, so we went to Russia. That was a very interesting international experience for me. We went to this small town in Russia, it's called Protvino, where there was an accelerator, a really old accelerator, and there was a competition for school teams in physics, where we were the only team from Western Europe. And this was in 1993, so this was actually really early on after the opening of Eastern Europe. So it was a really interesting experience. That was part of my motivation why I wanted to study physics. I was 14 when I started college. If you think that's weird, I heard just last week that there is this Belgian boy who was 9 and graduated from college, so I'm just very slow. I was 14 when I started college, and then I studied physics, also in my hometown in Groningen. Anybody with a physics background here? Yeah, okay, so physics is really nice up to a point. So it's nice because what I liked about it is that you can use very simple laws to describe lots of phenomena in the natural world. The point when it stopped being nice was quantum mechanics. Quantum mechanics, anybody's taken any quantum mechanics courses? Yeah, so you may know what I'm talking about. It's a big mess, like it's a philosophical mess. Nobody knows what anything means, and when it comes to elementary particles, it becomes very messy and not beautiful laws anymore. So that was also the point where I started thinking, well, I'm not sure if I like this anymore, but I'm on this path, and everybody's thinking that I'm going to be the next Einstein, so maybe I should be the next Einstein. And so this was like, there are 2 levels of expectations that were stacked on top of each other. One derived from me being much younger than everybody else. The other from being in physics per se, because the culture in physics is very much that you have to be a genius. It's a very genius-centered culture. So it's much less about hard work. You can make it with hard work, and it's much more or you have an innate talent to succeed in physics, right? So it's almost this constant IQ test that you're doing, and you're competing with your peers. And to be completely frank, I really enjoyed that in those days. I was very competitive. In some ways, I'm still very competitive, but I think back in those days, it was sort of at an unhealthy level. So I graduated when I was 17, and then I went to do my PhD in the same university. It was a big mistake. It's very common in Europe to stay in the same university throughout your career, especially from undergrad to grad. Here, it's fortunately not very common. It's not a very good idea because you're exposed to the same set of ideas, so you don't really expand your horizons, and it's, in retrospect, it was a mistake. What was even more a mistake was that I stayed with the same advisor that I had worked with as an undergrad. Now, that by itself could work out great if the advisor is great, but my advisor in undergrad, he was somebody who had made a name for himself in statistical physics in the 1970s, and he pretty much hadn't done shit since. And the way that it works, the way that you, at least traditionally in the European system, that you climb up the academic ladder, like you get promoted to higher and higher levels, ranks of professor, is by growing older. That's pretty much the recipe. You have to reach certain ages to reach certain ranks. So it's a very old-fashioned system. People are trying to change it. In some places it has been changed, but I was still very much in the middle of that system. So my advisor at that time was very close to retirement, but he was sort of this senior figure in the department, and I didn't come from an academic family. So my mom had studied English literature, but she had dropped out of college. So I didn't really have the background to inform me about how to choose an advisor. So I sort of looked up to this guy who was seemed very wise and very experienced. Right? So I decided to stick with him. There was another advisor who actually warned me against continuing to working with him, somebody else in the department, and then I ratted on him. I told my advisor that the other person had talked to me. That was very immature, and it was, I'm still ashamed of that. So my advisor was not on top of what was happening. In addition to that, I was very interested in a topic that was very hot in those days, like quantum gravity, finding a unifying theory of all physical forces that he knew nothing about. So this was a match made in hell from the start, and I didn't realize it. So I was still on this cloud where I thought of myself that I would be sort of the next Einstein, and that I was also very monomaniacal and just focusing on that one thing by myself without any guidance. And it was a recipe for disaster. There might be some people who can work that way without any good advice and without any people to give you useful feedback, but I wasn't one of them. So about 2.5 years into my PhD, I had absolutely nothing to show for it. So I would have meetings with my advisor where I would ramble on something that I had thought would be meaningful, and he would say, he would nod, and he would sort of think, oh yeah, that's great, Wei Ji. I then didn't have actual content to it. So I could have completely failed my PhD, but then at some point there was a build-up of people who would start telling me, you're not on the right path, you have to change something, this is not going anywhere. So then I realized, I finally listened to them about 2.5 years in, and I found a second advisor. Has a bit of a sensitive question here, but has anybody here switched labs or considered switching labs? Okay, all right. Love to hear your experiences at some point. So in some cases, problems can be worked out. In some cases, you have to just cut your losses and you have to just switch. And when students come talk to me now, I often notice that they're very afraid to take that step and actually switch labs. Why? Because they often blame themselves, right? They think, I'm not working hard enough, or I'm not meeting other people's expectations. But sometimes, in some cases, the lab environment itself is really not nurturing, or it's even toxic, and then you better get out of there as soon as you can. So that's something that I've advised many students, and in some cases that was really the best outcome. Yeah, so for me, I found a second advisor, so I didn't completely abandon the first advisor. I found a second advisor, different university in Holland, much younger, in that field, on top of that field, the field that I actually wanted to work in. So this was now slightly changed. It was called string theory. That was sort of the type of theoretical physics that is purely theoretical. It's almost abstract, almost completely abstract math. Back in those days, they had no connection to experiment. They say in 20 years we will have experimental predictions. And now it's 20 years later and there's still no experimental predictions. So that's the kind of field that it was. It was sort of an extreme continuation of what I just sketched, where there's a lot of emphasis on brilliance, and there's these few thought leaders who make the big steps, and then everybody else is following them for a couple of years until there's a new thought. It was also a very solitary working environment. So in neuroscience and psychology, we're used to collaborations, right? Collaborations is second nature. Right? Everybody's probably involved in some kind of collaboration. In physics, that's very rare. You work by yourself, usually with your advisor, but you mostly work by yourself. I didn't like that. And it also turned out that my lack of productivity was not just because of my first advisor, it was also because of the topic. So I was now in a relatively good environment, at least 1 or 2 days a week, but I was working together. Actually, this was slightly contradictory to what I was just said. So I was not working completely by myself. I was working with another grad student on that project. But this other grad student was way ahead of me all the time, right? So I always felt that I had to catch up on where he was, and he always came up with the good ideas. And if you read my PhD, my thesis, it's based on 2 papers, and on both of those 2 papers, the other grad student did 70% of the work, and I was sort of the assistant trying to fill in the gaps. And that meant that my PhD has never felt like it was my own. Does it make sense? Like, I've never felt ownership about the things that I've done. It's always like, I have to sort of get through this, and it's not pleasant, and I don't quite understand what's going on, but I have to get through this. Anybody in that situation? Okay. if you're a first year, that's okay. If you're second year, it's also okay. If you're feeling that throughout your PhD, then yeah, I hope you're never. I hope you're never going to be there. So how did I deal with that? So I was in this weird situation where, on the one hand, people still saw me as a genius, because that never goes away if you're 4 years younger. In this case, now 5 years younger. But I was also sort of doing really poorly on a day-to-day basis. So the coping strategy that I developed, and only in retrospect it was a coping strategy, is that I started doing a lot of extracurricular things. And I started being very active in this nature observation organization. So this was like bird watchers and like people who like to look at insects and plants, and we would have like camps and excursions. And I wasn't actually into birds or insects or plants. I liked organizing, and I liked to have a peer group, and I liked to be away from this place where the expectations were, I couldn't live up to expectations. I became very involved in Dutch politics. So there's this youth organization of the Dutch Labour Party. It's called the Young Socialists. So I became very interested, very active in Dutch politics, also organizing debates. Like I was 18 when I moderated my first public debate. In retrospect, that was because I was really interested in those issues. I was interested in like Israel-Palestine issue. That was a big then as it is now, in education and environmental issues. But it was also an escape. And I could tell myself that, well, maybe the reason that I'm not doing so well in my physics is because I'm spending so much time on all of those other things. So it's sort of this vicious cycle, right? Where I found fulfillment in all those other things, and that, of course, didn't really improve my physics. Now, at this point, you might be thinking, like, how did this guy ever get his PhD? And that's a really good question. So the way that happened was that I had this conversation with my second advisor where we were talking about my future, and he was thinking of he was asking me, what do you want to do? And I say, well, I'm really not quite sure. I'm considering several things, but I'm definitely not going to continue in physics. And then he said, oh yeah, then it's okay that you defend. So the implication was that if I actually wanted to continue in physics, it wouldn't have been good enough. And that was very fair, because that would have been, I would be way below my peers in that regard. Now, what was I going to do? So one thing I was considering, and this sounds a little bit silly, is I was 21 years old at that time when I was defending, so then I considered going into Dutch politics because I felt strongly about these things. But like politics is a very special kind of business, and you also need some life experience to actually do that well. So as a 21-year-old to go into politics is probably not the best idea, unless you're AOC. Then the other thing I was considering was McKinsey. Anybody knows McKinsey? So it's this business consulting company that has these quantitative approaches. It was sort of data science before data science, right? So lots of physicists would go into McKinsey, into business consulting. So I went to their Amsterdam office. I did an interview there. The first part was this math test, but then applied to business problems. I did fine on that. But then there was a conversation that you would have with the associates or with the partners, and it was about economic situations, and they would ask you like on-the-spot thinking questions, like supermarkets put the fruits and the vegetables near the entrance, right? Can you quickly think of 10 reasons why they do that? And then you have to come up with 10 reasons. I don't want you to start thinking about that now, but there are not even 10 reasons, but they want you to think on the spot, which is something that's important in their world. And then they ask, like, have you been reading the economics page of the Dutch newspaper every day? I said, not if I can avoid it. I didn't say that part, but that was the truth. And then the interviewer said, yes, you should really start doing that, because I've been reading the economics page since I was 16, and there's a lot of good information about that, about financial markets and about mergers and acquisitions. And then I said, yeah, maybe this is not for me. So then I thought, well, maybe I should give science one more chance. And this is really my thought. I should give science one more chance. I realized maybe there are other kinds of science besides physics. That's radical. That's really radical. If you're a physicist, you don't actually think that there are other kinds of science than physics, because you think, and this is appropriate that I stand up now, that physics at the top of the pyramid, then chemistry is applied physics, biology is applied chemistry, and neuroscience and psychology are somewhere down in the basement, so something else you actually look down on. So then I very much had those kind of prejudices. My mom was actually very interested in psychology, but sort of at a very lay person's point of view. She was subscribed to this Psychology Today kind of magazine. And I actually was quite interested in the human brain and in consciousness. And I remember that I would go to this psychology symposium where somebody would talk about the McGurk effect. Who knows what the McGurk effect is? Right, so it's this audio-visual illusion where somebody says something different than what you see, and nobody notices that. And I was really blown away by that illusion. If you remember the first time that you see that, it's really amazing. The second thing I was really amazed by is that somebody could make a living studying that. Because that didn't seem like real science. Do I have to stay in the picture in a particular frame? Okay, and just try to make this a more challenging evening for you. But yeah, so then I had to admit to myself that I was actually really interested in doing something related to psychology. Now, I had one saving grace, which is that, actually two. So one is that there was this field called computational neuroscience. And in those days, this was 2001. This was just an emerging field. It was new. It was hot, and lots of physicists went from physics into computational neuroscience. So there were ways for me to do a postdoc in computational neuroscience. Now, the second lucky thing was that because I got my PhD at 22, I was in the Dutch newspapers and on the TV. So then people knew me. So when I put in this postdoc application, this grant to the Dutch government saying, I want to study consciousness using the methods of statistical physics, they didn't say, oh, this is such a bunch of bullshit, let's throw this out. They said, oh, this is Wei Ji Ma who was on TV yesterday, let's give him this grant. So that's how I got my grant, and that's how I went to Caltech studying consciousness in Christoph Koch's lab. So Christoph Koch was at Caltech, and he was a former physicist, and he had switched to doing computational neuroscience, and he had an interest in consciousness. So that seemed like a perfect match. Consciousness is something that you can actually study scientifically, as many of you know. It's hard, but you can do it. That postdoc didn't work out for me at all. And one part of it is that I came to that consciousness question with these delusions of grandeur. So I still had escaped from physics, but that allowed me to then pick up this idea that I would make the next breakthrough in my new field, right? Because, of course, as a physicist, I would just show up there, build the bull in the china shop, and overturn all the existing paradigms, right? That's the kind of mentality that many physicists come into neuroscience with. Larry Abbott wrote something about that. Like, it takes some time for a physicist to be cured of the physicist arrogance. And on top of that, for me, there was also the arrogance that came with being 4 years younger than everybody else. So that didn't help, the combination of being a physicist, a former physicist, and 4 years younger, and studying consciousness. It's a bad combination, right? You end up again in this environment where you do nothing really productive and you only think very highly of yourself. The second thing that didn't really work out is that Christoph's mentorship style didn't match with mine. So Christoph was already quite well known at the time, so he had this very big lab, maybe 20 students and postdocs. He was traveling all the time, so I was really lucky to be meeting with him once every 2 or 3 weeks for half an hour. Anybody in that situation that you're lucky to be meeting once every 2 weeks? Okay, I'm sorry to hear that. That happens and quite a lot, and sometimes that works out, sometimes it doesn't. If you're really independent, it might work. I wasn't very independent. And here's where the laziness comes in. So I sort of was in this mode where I was used to doing a lot of extracurriculars and not working very hard on my science. On top of that, there was a complication, which is that I was 22, and this was the first time, or in the meantime I had turned 23, but this was the first time that I had lived away from my mom, and I moved from this small town in Holland to LA. So let's say there are lots of distractions then, right? Like, you could go to the clubs in Hollywood, or you go to the beach in Santa Monica, and you could go hiking in the high Sierras, and I did all of those things, and then probably a little bit too much. And I joined the undergraduate chess club at Caltech, and we would go to the tournaments in Southern California. So I had a lot of fun, and I got very little done in my first postdoc. So if you look at my CV, and in case you think that I'm making all of this up, you can just look at my CV, and you see that I have only one book chapter from my first postdoc. Only one book chapter with Christoph on it. In the meantime, I had started some collaborations with other postdocs, and those eventually also become papers. So I have 2 other papers where Christoph Koch is not an author, but those themselves were pretty successful papers. I actually had taken up those projects as procrastination projects because I didn't want to work on my main project, so I started talking to this experimental psychologist in Christoph's lab and who wanted to collaborate her, and I said, well, maybe you can help out with that, and that was a way of procrastinating for me. Any big procrastinators here? Okay, everybody else is a procrastinator, doesn't want to admit it, right? Okay, cool. All right, I get it. So I'm not afraid to admit that I'm a huge procrastinator, right? Like, I think, looking back, and this is me doing amateur psychoanalysis on myself, this has to do with the fact that everything just came to me when I was younger, right? And I never had to work for getting recognition from my peers and from my environment. So that means that I thought I could get away with all of it and never learned how to work hard. I often hear that when people have an easy time up to some point in their career, and then they go to top school, and then they suddenly have to work hard. That's a bit of a shock to the system. So I've always been a big procrastinator. In college and in grad school and in my first postdoc, one of my big things was also online chess. Anybody plays online chess? Oh, awesome. What side do you play on?
So I normally play against friends on like WeChess.
Okay.
Or also like chess.com.
Yeah, chess.com has been like a big time sink for me. And then play chess, and then in those days you had chessclub.com and Free Chess Club and FICS, I think. I can name them all. I've been at all of them. I think some of them keep track of how many hours you actually spent on them, and I think it's of the order of 10,000 hours that I spent on chess servers. So I became a really good blitz chess player. And this is not like chess where you sit there and then you think carefully about your move, and you have a rich thought process, and then you analyze afterwards. This is more like a video game, where you have 3 minutes to finish the entire game. Okay, so you have to make all your moves within, you know what I'm talking about, right? Within a time limit of 3 minutes, and if you lose, if you run out of time, you lose on time. Okay, so it's more like a video game. It's very addictive. It's very, very addictive. So many times when I actually had a deadline to work on, I would play online chess into the night. And then like online dating sites were new at the time, so I also spent a lot of time on that. It was not the best use of the time. Then in 2 years after that, like this was 2000, we're now in 2004, and quite well remember this. This was March 2004. I had a meeting with my advisor, Christoph Koch, and pretty much he was asking me, what the hell have you been doing in my lab for the past 2 years? And I didn't have much to show for it. And he said, well, I'm sorry, money is out, you have to leave in 2 months. And actually he said, you have to leave in a month. And I was completely shocked, because I thought I would get away with everything. So like being kicked out of a lab was just not on my radar. I didn't think this was possible. This would happen to other people. It would not happen to me. And I was able to extend it by another month, so I had a very short period of time. I don't remember exactly. I had 2 to 3 months to look for another position. And if you have just one book chapter from your first postdoc, your chances are not good in general. So I was very lucky that in that period, there was a guest speaker, Alex Pouget, who came to Caltech, and he met with postdocs the way that speakers meet with postdocs. So I was talking to him about my project, and it was related to what he was doing. So I asked, I'm struggling with this issue about how neural populations encode probability distributions. I see that you've written about this. Can you explain this to me? I think it could be way A or it could be way B, and can you tell me which one is right? And even though Alex Pouget was already pretty high up in the ranks at that point, he was quite well known, he actually really took the time to explain that he didn't know the answer to this. And that was really nice. It was very nice to see in a very senior scientist to be very open about what they didn't know. That kind of humility you don't always see. Very often you see that people just want to show off what they know. And that humility was especially surprising because he was French. Did I offend anybody here? Anyway, so I joined his lab. He gave me a second chance, essentially. Because I had nothing to show for it, but I still was able to join his lab. It came at a price. The price was living in Rochester, New York. Anybody from upstate New York? I'm so sorry. That you're from there. Yeah, so I managed to offend lots of people in this talk. Now, Rochester is great in many ways. I didn't like it. It was just too boring for me. I'm a big city person. And Rochester has like 6 months of snow. That got old for me very quickly. So scientifically, it was a pretty good time. And the reason that it was a good time for me was Alex was a very different kind of mentor. So he had a lab that had maybe 4 or 5 people at a time, as opposed to 20 people. And he would meet with us very regularly, sometimes too regularly. He would come in the morning and say, oh, last night I had this great idea, let's talk about it right now. And that was actually really good for me, because I was kept on my toes all along, and I was part of a group of people who talk about scientific ideas. And that was the first time that I realized that like this social aspect of doing science, that's so important, that you don't have to be a loner, you can actually work together in a team. And this period didn't come without issues. Like for the first 3 months, I still tried procrastinating and not doing very much. But then instead of 2 years in, 3 months in, Alex asked me, what the fuck have you been doing here? And I said, yeah, I tried to talk my way out of it, but he saw through that. He said, yeah, that's just not enough. If you want to make it in science, you have to step up your game. And I stepped up my game. So this is the second postdoc. This is actually really late in the game, but I managed to get some good papers out of that period. The other thing that went wrong in that period is that I was working with Jeff Beck. Now, Jeff Beck is a great person, so working with Jeff Beck was actually fantastic, but he was, again, somebody who was always several steps ahead of me in terms of thinking. So he was a co-author of several of my early papers, early being from that period, 2006, 2008, and he actually contributed most of the intellectual content to those papers. So this is sort of a déjà vu to my PhD. So he came from an applied math background, so that's sort of comparable, theoretical physics, applied math. So I always felt that I had to measure up to him, but I never felt that I was good enough. Right? So who here has heard of imposter complex? Great. I'm glad to see that most of you do. In case you haven't heard of it, this is the sense that you don't actually belong in a place. It is the sense that you're an imposter, that you're deceiving people into thinking that you belong somewhere. It's the sense that it's just a matter of time before your advisor is going to find out that you're not actually so good. It's the sense that somebody made a mistake in the admissions process, and it's a mistake that you're where you are. Anybody has felt that way? Okay, great, good. By the way, also faculty feel that way. I'm glad to see that. That's always the case in these sessions. Faculty also feel that way. So imposter complex is super common in academia. And you saw that almost everybody raised their hand here. Right? So if everybody feels that an imposter, nobody is. Right? And in particular, imposter complex is widespread in many high-performing areas, business, arts, but and often it's also a little bit more women than men, but in academia it's actually gender balanced. If you're part of some kind of underrepresented minority, you're at a greater risk of imposter complex, of these imposter feelings. So how do you deal with those feelings? This is an interesting conversation. I actually want to have that conversation with you, like how do you deal with those feelings? But I'll tell you what I do. So one thing is that over time I've come to realize that being successful in academia is really very multidimensional. So even though Jeff Beck was much more intuitive in the math, like he had a much better intuition for the math, and he made bigger strides than me in that regard, he was not the best presenter of his work. Okay, so he would talk to others as if they had the same background as himself. Now guess, once you go on the job market, what is more important, to doing sophisticated math or being able to explain what you do to general audiences? The second, absolutely, right? Because you're going to give a job talk to people with a wide variety of backgrounds. So even though Jeff deserved to get a faculty position before me, it took him a little bit longer. Right? So one thing is to realize that success has many dimensions, and nobody has everything. Nobody has everything, and you're going to find your own niche. Another thing is to find flaws in other people's work. That's one of my biggest hobbies, especially if other people are sort of very well-established scientists, like the leaders in the field that you look up to, who give the very polished talks at conferences, and then you start poking holes at their work, and then the holes become very obvious. And of course it sounds awful, but I hope that you see what I mean here, right? That it helps to see that science is fucking hard, even for the best people in the field, right? And so we all struggle. So you have, when your experiment doesn't work, or your collaborator understands everything faster than you, or if you spend 3 days debugging your code, it's not because of your personal failures. And most of the time, it's not because of your personal failures. Most of the time, it's because science is fucking hard. The other thing is that mentorship also is an important factor here, right? Like, if you are in a good mentorship environment, then all of these problems are going to be much easier to deal with, right? You might get practical help. Maybe somebody else can look at your code. Maybe your advisor can meet with you earlier to give you a new direction. So besides blaming yourself, you should also blame your advisor more. That's also something I keep saying. Blame your advisor. It's a really, really useful thing to do. And so yeah, and then of course the most important thing I shouldn't forget, which is that imposter feelings is something that, because everybody has it, you really benefit from talking to each other about it, right? That you share how you feel about it, and you realize that these are universal feelings. It helps you deal with them. And for me, I must say this has gotten a lot better over the years. So then we at the stage, now in 2008, I finished my second postdoc, which was 4 years. Then I went on the job market in 2007 for the first time. And the first year that I was on the job market, I got 7 interviews and 0 offers. So something went wrong there. I still don't know exactly what. The second year, I got 2 interviews and 2 offers. What probably made a difference is that in between some papers came out, so that's a very concrete thing that may have made a difference. And then I had a choice between going to UCSD, Cognitive Science, which was great, and Baylor College of Medicine in Houston, where I would have like a collaborator who did monkey physiology and was interested in very much the same questions as me. So I decided to go there. So it was from the extreme cold to the extreme hot. Houston is like very hot and humid. So like people go from their air-conditioned house to their air-conditioned car, and the few steps in between is hell. I tried to actually survive without a car. I had a bike through my time in Houston. And then occasionally I would borrow a car to buy groceries. But the way that I started at Houston was very interesting. So I had a couple of papers from my second postdoc, but overall my CV didn't look very good. And if you just look at my CV around 2007, 2008, it's objectively just not competitive. Like if we were to interview somebody like that, or we consider somebody like that, they would not have a very high chance. So when I started, the chair had this welcome meeting with me. And I said, welcome to the department, Wei Ji. You know that we hire people for 2 reasons. There are people we hire for their accomplishments, and we're people we hire for their promise. You clearly fall in the second category. Which was very offensive and very true at the same time. It was a good time. It was a good time. Some people think that being a postdoc is the best time of their lives. Who's a postdoc now? Do you feel this is your best time of your life? So I am. I differ a little bit. So I actually think being a professor has been the best time of my life. So I think the difference is that I don't mind the managing that comes with being a professor. I actually like organizing. I love organizing. That probably comes from my days as organizing for political organizations, etc. So I have no trouble with that. Grants is always unpleasant, but it's not something that I mind that much. And I love doing many things at the same time. So of course you can do that more easily if you're a professor. And I think I also like I'm pretty bossy. So I think I like setting the agenda. So I don't like people telling me what to do. So as a postdoc, you always have that still. So then, like being an assistant professor was a really good time. It came with its own challenges, like how to hire people. Like at some point you might be in a situation that you have to hire other people. And a very tempting thing is to look at their CV. You have to be very careful with that, because even if somebody's CV is stellar, like personal chemistry and how they fit into your lab or into your group is so much more important. Right? So I've made some mistake that way, where I hired somebody too much based on CV and too little based on personal chemistry. Now, the other thing is that I now had to be responsible for other people. So that took away a little bit of the procrastination, because you create this social environment where people depend on each other, and it's not just me for myself, right? So then it's, I found that one of the most effective ways to overcome procrastination. This was also the time that a colleague of mine actually told me about imposter complex, and that has a name. And then I felt very validated, because if a phenomenon has a name, then of course it exists, right? And then I started reading more about it, and I realized that it is so common. Now I'm at NYU. So how did I go from Baylor to NYU? So this happened in 2012, 2013. Is anybody here in a long-distance relationship? Okay, all right. So love to hear your experience on that as well. So I was in a long-distance relationship for 8 years. We're still married, so it's possible, but it was pretty unpleasant. So I was in Rochester. My now wife was a medical student in New York. Then I moved to Houston. She moved in with me for 1 year doing an internship. Then she moved to Philly. She was a resident here for 4 years, 3 years. Then fellowship for 2 years, also at Penn, neurocritical care, neurology, neurocritical care. So we did Houston to Philly for 3 years. Then I moved to New York, and we did New York to Houston for 2 years. She moved in with me in 2015, and now we have a baby. So things are okay now. But it was hard, right? Like, it was hard when I was in Houston, and it was a good reason for me to look elsewhere. And she wanted to stay in the Northeast. Of course, you try to sort of see the good sides of it, right? You don't have to clean up after yourself. You can live like a bachelor, but in the end, it still sucks, right? So it's a very personal choice if you are sacrificing, like that kind of personal happiness for academic careers. At the same time, you also don't want to have one person sacrifice their career for the other. So it's a very, very tricky business, and yeah, it's very personal. So the other reason was that NYU, especially the psychology and the neuroscience department at NYU, were very close to my interests, so very computational perception, decision making. So I moved in 2013, and interestingly, 2013, when I was hired by NYU, that was the only moment that the first moment that my imposter complex completely went away. Because in Baylor, it's Baylor College of Medicine, so it was a medical school. So it was very translationally, molecularly oriented neuroscience. So I felt I had gotten away with something there, right? Like I had, again, deceived them into thinking that I was good, but actually I wasn't. But at NYU, I couldn't make that argument anymore, because everybody was sort of in the same field. If they hired me, there must have been something actually good about my work. It's really strange if you think about it, that you get only that external validation takes away your imposter complex. Now, procrastination is something that I still struggle with very much. So in June of this year, I learned about this NSF grant that was due on November 14th that I wanted to apply to. I thought I'd take enough time to start working on the grant. So I wanted to start working in September, okay? I didn't start in September. I didn't start in October. I didn't start in early November. I had 1 week left for the grant. Then I had 4 days left for the grant. It was a Sunday. The due date was November 14th. This is Thursday. I started that Sunday. In between, in that period, there were lots and lots of days where I spent until 3 or 4 a.m. on playchess.com, on chess.com, playing online chess. It's that bad. It's that bad. It's not technically an addiction, because I think for an addiction it has to be sort of like impairing your daily work, but it's very, very close. It's very, very close. I got the grant in on time, but it was 3 hours before the deadline, with the graduate student who was actually dependent on the grant sitting next to me in my office and say, "Now you work, Wei Ji." This is how it works. Of course, I still don't know if I'm going to get the grant, and this story is only a good story if I actually get the grant, but I completely deserve to not get that grant with that kind of procrastination. So at NYU, I've become a very active. I've become even more active in organizing. So I've co-founded not just Growing Up in Science, but also the Scientists and Action and Advocacy Network. So this is this group where we work with non-profit organizations to help them with their scientific arguments. So one group that we work with was trying to raise the age of criminal responsibility from 16 to 18 years old in New York State, right? Because it's completely wrong morally and scientifically to treat 16-year-olds as if they're adults, right? So we help them form their scientific case for that, and eventually that legislation passed. So it made us feel that we had contributed something to a social cause. We've also worked on plastic bag legislation, so plastic bags are now going to be banned in New York State starting March. So that was also a little bit of a success. So that has made me feel very close to actually doing something useful with my science. My actual papers, they're not very useful. And despite of what we write in grants, there's no direct line between the end product of a scientific project and some utility for society. And for some of you that might be very different, I hope it is, but reality is that often it's very different. Also, I've become much more aware that all science is political. So you might not be thinking about that very much, because as scientists, we are not trained to think that way. That's all science is political. But if you're a grad student and you don't get health insurance, that's politics, right? And it will affect your work, right? If you have an accident and it doesn't get fully covered, that's a big deal. Who runs studies with online subjects? Anyone here? Like MTurk, for example. Payment issues for online subjects, big political issue. They often get paid way below the minimum wage. Animal experimentations, big ethical issues there. If you are changing your research direction because that increases the probability that your advisor is going to get a grant, well, you have to think about who's funding that grant. Political issue. If you are considering going into data science, well, did you think about that Google is helping the military develop drones, which kill civilians, right? So there's a lot of places where politics really invades our science. It's very hard to find pure science, and I've become very aware of it. And that's even aside all the issues with diversity and inclusion. That there's so much here that I feel I've been uneducated about, that I've not been aware about, and I'm trying to sort of catch up on that. And that brings us to the present. So unfortunately, I already am a little bit over time, but I'm available for the next hour if you want to stay and actually talk about it. I would love to hear how you deal with imposter complex, with difficult advisors, with long-distance relationships, with chess addiction. So thank you very much for listening.